my son was there and I killed her. I'm real sure my son didn't see it, but that only happened one time.
It begins the same way it always does. A smile in a photograph, a stranger who holds the door open, a face that looks ordinary, maybe even kind. But sometimes that smile is a mask. Sometimes behind the warmth there is hunger. And sometimes the man next to you in line is a predator waiting for night to fall. The late 20th century created a new kind of killer, no longer the shadow in the alley or the drifter by the highway, but men who lived next door. Men who went to work, paid bills, raised families, and hunted in the same neighborhoods where they waved good morning. They looked human because they were, and that was the most terrifying part. They used charm instead of force, lies instead of chains. They learned that trust was the easiest way to trap a victim. They photographed them, courted them, married them, and buried them. The world gave them names to understand the madness. The dating game killer, the Green River killer, the Grim Sleeper. Each name a headline meant to simplify something too complex for language. These were not monsters born from myths or nightmares. They were men, and they chose evil, one decision at a time. Each killing made them bolder, each victim made them colder, and with every year that passed, they learned how to blend in better. They walked among us for decades. They smiled at cameras. They laughed with neighbors. They stood trial only after they had already destroyed countless lives. Their stories remind us that the line between man and monster is thinner than we ever want to believe. That sometimes, the devil doesn't hide in the dark. He stands right beside you in daylight. These are their stories. 10 killers who turned trust into terror and life into a weapon. Men whose names still echo in police files and nightmares. Men who showed us that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, and sometimes it wins. This is the most evil serial killers of all time, Part 3. It begins in the 1970s with a man whose charm fooled a television audience and whose camera captured death instead of beauty. Rodney Alcala, United States, 1977. He was the kind of man who made people feel comfortable, tall, handsome, confident, the type who smiled easily and remembered names. But behind that charm was a sickness so deep that even those who looked into his eyes never saw it until it was far too late. His name was Rodney Alcala. To the world, he was a photographer, an artist, and even a minor celebrity. To the women who met him, he was danger disguised as opportunity. His story began in the late 1960s, when an 8-year-old girl in Los Angeles accepted a ride from him. He lured her into his apartment, assaulted her, and left her for dead. By pure chance, she survived. But by the time police identified Alcala, he had already fled the state. He changed his name, grew his hair, and reinvented himself as a photographer in New York. He enrolled in film school, studying under Roman Polanski, and spent his days taking portraits of women in Central Park. He was polite, intelligent, well-spoken, all the things a killer shouldn't be. And that made him perfect at what he did. For years, Alcala drifted between coasts, taking photos of women and children under the pretense of building his portfolio. He carried a camera and confidence in equal measure. He would charm his victims, tell them they had the perfect look, and once they were alone, the mask came off. He strangled them until they lost consciousness, revived them, and strangled them again, playing God in a ritual of domination and control. Detectives would later say he enjoyed watching life fade in return, as though he were testing how long a human soul could stay trapped in its body. In 1978, Alcala appeared on national television as a contestant on The Dating Game. He joked with the host, flirted with the Bachelorette, and smiled for the audience. He won the date, but she never went. Something in him felt wrong, she said. Something she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. That intuition saved her life. What no one in that audience knew was that Alcala was already a serial killer. By the time he smiled into that camera, several women were already dead. He used charm as camouflage, blending charisma with cruelty. His victims were artists, students, models, children, anyone who trusted him long enough to stand in front of his lens. In 1979, his facade cracked. A 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso disappeared while riding her bike to ballet class in Huntington Beach, California. Her remains were found in the mountains days later. The investigation led straight to Alcala. When detectives searched his home, they found his secret, a storage locker filled with trophies, jewelry, clothing, and hundreds of photographs of unidentified women and children. Some looked alive, others did not. He was arrested and sentenced to death in 1980. But his intelligence and legal cunning gave him power even behind bars. He appealed, represented himself, and secured retrials. Each time, more evidence surfaced. DNA linked him to murders in New York, Los Angeles, and Wyoming. By 2010, he had been convicted of 8 killings, though investigators believed there were many more. Some estimates placed his true count in the hundreds. In one of his final trials, Alcala cross-examined himself in court, switching between roles as prosecutor and witness, arguing with his own reflection. The courtroom sat silent, watching madness wear the face of intellect. He smiled through it all, as if every word was part of a performance only he understood. In 2011, police released the photographs found in his possession, more than 100 images of unknown women and girls. Some came forward alive, recognizing themselves from decades earlier. Others were identified by families of the missing, and many remain mysteries, frozen in time, their stories untold. Alcala spent his remaining years on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He grew frail, his hair turning gray, his health failing. But his eyes stayed sharp, calculating, cold, alive. When asked if he felt remorse, he smirked. He never apologized. He never explained. He simply said, "Some things are better left unsaid." He died in prison in 2021 at the age of 77. His victims' families never got the answers they wanted, only the closure of knowing he could never hurt again. To this day, detectives still review his photographs, searching for missing faces and forgotten files. Each picture carries the same eerie energy, smiles caught in the instant before something terrible happened. They are not just photos, they are tombstones in ink and paper. Rodney Alcala was proof that evil does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it asks for your trust, and sometimes it even wins a game show. And while California was haunted by a killer with a camera, another man in Washington was turning rivers into graveyards. A murderer so prolific that investigators would call his crimes an epidemic of death. Gary Ridgway, United States, 1982. It began with a river, a quiet stretch of water south of Seattle that carried more than just the reflection of the sky. In the summer of 1982, a young boy found the first body floating near the edge. She was naked, strangled, discarded like something no one would ever miss. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield. She was 16 years old. Over the next few weeks, more bodies appeared. Women, teenagers, all near the same spot along the Green River. Each one had been strangled and abandoned in the woods. Each one was someone society had already forgotten. Police were overwhelmed. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no leads that made sense. But the killer had a pattern, and it was perfect. His name was Gary Ridgway, a quiet man with a dull smile and a life so ordinary that no one ever looked twice. He worked as a truck painter, attended church on Sundays, and lived in a modest house in the suburbs. He was married, punctual, polite, and at night, he hunted. Ridgway's victims were women living on the margins, sex workers, runaways, and girls who would not be missed quickly. He offered rides, promised money, sometimes just conversation. They trusted him because he seemed safe. In his truck, he would choke them from behind, often using his hands, sometimes a ligature. He later said he liked strangulation because he could see their faces when they died. He dumped the bodies along the Green River or deep in the woods, often in clusters. Sometimes he returned to the sites days later, not to bury evidence, but to relive the act. He said the woods made him feel calm. By 1984, investigators had found more than a dozen bodies. The media called him the Green River Killer. A task force was formed, one of the largest in American history. Among the experts brought in to help was another killer, Ted Bundy, who advised police that the man they were hunting was local, methodical, and likely revisiting his victims' remains. Bundy's insight, chillingly accurate, narrowed the search, but not enough. Ridgway had already been questioned several times. He smiled, answered politely, and passed polygraph tests. Detectives described him as too boring to be a killer. That dullness was his camouflage. He remarried, worked overtime, and kept attending church. He even joined a Bible study group. To his neighbors, he was dependable. To his victims, he was death. He later told detectives that killing had become routine. Like washing dishes, he said. He killed quickly, efficiently, without hesitation or regret. When asked how many women he had murdered, he shrugged. "I lost count," he said. Through the 1980s and 90s, the Green River Task Force followed every lead. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, and thousands of tips were filed. But Ridgway stayed one step ahead. He had no pattern beyond opportunity. He killed when he could, where he could, as long as it was easy. Then came the break. By 2001, DNA technology had advanced. Evidence from early crime scenes, tiny traces of saliva and semen, were retested. The results pointed to one man, Gary Ridgway. He was arrested outside the Kenworth Truck Company, where he had worked for 3 decades. When police surrounded him, he did not run. He looked confused and said, "What took you so long?" In custody, he was eerily calm. He confessed with precision, describing each killing like a routine chore. He admitted to choking women in his truck, sometimes while his son's toys sat in the back seat. He said he killed sex workers because they were easy to pick up, easy to kill, and easy to forget. To him, they were not people. They were problems he could solve. Over time, he confessed to 71 murders. Investigators officially confirmed 49. He led detectives to shallow graves in forests and ravines, pointing casually to where he left each body. Each discovery was another heartbreak for a family who had waited decades for answers. In 2003, he stood in court as the verdict was read. He received 48 consecutive life sentences without parole. As the families of his victims spoke, some screamed, some wept, some forgave. Ridgway barely moved. When one mother shouted, "You animal!" he smiled faintly, almost as if it pleased him to be seen that way. He is now in his 70s, serving his sentence in a maximum security prison in Washington state. He spends most of his time reading the Bible, the same book he once used to disguise his guilt. He has never shown genuine remorse. Gary Ridgway remains one of the most prolific serial killers in history. His victims, mostly women between 14 and 38, were forgotten by the world long before he found them. He hunted in the silence between highways, and his trophies were not possessions, but memories of control. The Green River still flows through Washington. On its surface, everything looks peaceful. But beneath, in the current and the soil, lies the weight of what he did, a reminder that even the calmest waters can hide the deepest horrors. And while Ridgway turned rivers into graveyards, another killer was evolving with the times. He didn't stalk the streets, he stalked the internet, one of the first to lure victims with promises typed through a screen. John Edward Robinson, United States, 1985. The world was changing. Technology was connecting people faster than ever before. Chat rooms, message boards, and emails were bringing strangers together. But for one man in Kansas, this new digital age became the perfect hunting ground. His name was John Edward Robinson, and he would be remembered as one of the first serial killers to use the internet as his weapon. To his neighbors, he was a husband, a father, a businessman. To his victims, he was a promise, a job, a relationship, a chance at a new life. To the police, he became something new entirely, a ghost who could kill from behind a keyboard. John Edward Robinson's story began long before the web. Born in the 1940s, he grew up in Illinois, smart but manipulative. By his 20s, he had already been arrested for fraud and forgery. He had a knack for lies and an ability to make people believe them. In the 1980s, he moved to Kansas City and began building a reputation as a successful entrepreneur. He opened fake companies, advertised fake jobs, and convinced young women to move to the area for opportunities that didn't exist. They came to him looking for work. They never left. He would meet them, promise them a future, and then take their lives. He stored some of their remains in metal barrels hidden on his property. Others simply vanished. There were no witnesses, no patterns, and no one who could see how wide his web had spread. Then, in the mid-1990s, Robinson found something new: the internet. Chat rooms gave him anonymity, and anonymity gave him power. He began exploring BDSM communities, posing as a dominant figure offering mentorship and adventure. He used names like Slave Master, JR, and Master John. To those who met him online, he appeared confident, experienced, and safe. To those who met him in person, he was death. His victims were often women seeking companionship, employment, or submission within the BDSM lifestyle. He promised them travel, money, and security. Once they trusted him, he silenced them permanently. In 1999, police began investigating the disappearance of several women linked to him through online messages. Detectives traced the Sowell digital conversations to Robinson's home in Kansas. When they searched his property, they found 2 decaying bodies locked inside chemical barrels. One of the women was Isabella Lewicka, a 21-year-old college student who had met him through the internet. The other was Suzette Troughton, a nurse who thought she was moving in with Robinson to care for his elderly father. Days later, investigators searched a rented storage locker he maintained across the state line in Missouri. Inside were 3 more barrels. Each contained a body. Each belonged to a woman who had trusted him. Robinson's arrest marked one of the first major cases in which the internet directly connected a killer to his victims. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and fraud. The press called him the Internet Slave Master. And as the evidence unfolded, it became clear that his crimes stretched back decades, long before the web gave him new tools to hunt. During interrogation, Robinson showed no emotion. He denied nothing, but he explained nothing. He simply stared at detectives, occasionally smirking when they listed another victim's name. It was as if he enjoyed the performance. At his trial in 2002, prosecutors presented the barrels, the photographs, and the digital evidence. Hundreds of emails where he promised love, safety, or servitude. Each one ended in the same lie. He was convicted of multiple murders in both Kansas and Missouri. The jury recommended death. His defense team argued for mercy, saying he was a product of greed and control. The judge disagreed. Robinson was sentenced to death in Kansas and life without parole in Missouri. He remains on death row today, appealing his sentence while refusing to acknowledge his crimes. What made John Edward Robinson truly terrifying wasn't just how he killed, it was how he adapted. He understood that technology gave him power. In every generation, he would have found a way to prey on trust. The internet simply gave him more doors to knock on. Detectives later described his home as a house of deception. Every room had a story, every promise was bait. He turned the desire for love and belonging into his weapon of choice. The women who died by his hands weren't naive. They were human. They wanted connection in a world that was becoming increasingly digital and detached. Robinson exploited that need, proving that technology can amplify both our best and our worst instincts. He once said, "People give you everything if you make them feel seen." For his victims, that illusion cost them their lives. John Edward Robinson's legacy is one of horror and evolution, a bridge between the old world of personal manipulation and the new world of digital deceit. He was proof that evil learns, adapts, and upgrades. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., United States, 1985. Los Angeles, a city built on light, but haunted by its shadows. For tourists, it is the home of stars and palm trees. For those who live beneath its surface, it can be a place where nightmares wear human faces. In the mid-'80s, as the crack epidemic tore through South Central Los Angeles, fear was already familiar. But no one expected the terror that was about to crawl out from those same streets. A predator was moving quietly through the neighborhoods, hunting women the world refused to protect. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr. The world would come to know him as the Grim Sleeper. His victims were mostly women of color, many struggling with addiction or homelessness. They disappeared from alleys, motels, and street corners, women whose lives the media rarely wrote about. Their bodies turned up in dumpsters, alleys, and abandoned lots, each one strangled or shot. And every time, the killer slipped away like smoke. Franklin's first known victim was Deborah Jackson, found in 1985. Her murder was brutal, her body discarded like garbage. Over the next 3 years, at least 7 more women were killed in the same way. The police called the unknown suspect the Southside Slayer, assuming one man was responsible for several similar cases. They were partly right. But Franklin's signature, his precision, his cold control, went unnoticed. By 1988, the killings suddenly stopped. The city breathed again. Detectives moved on to other cases. They believed the killer had been arrested, moved, or died. They were wrong. 14 years passed. And then, in 2002, he returned. The same neighborhoods, the same victims, the same method. It was as though death itself had been sleeping and had just awakened. That silence between murders earned him the name the Grim Sleeper. But detectives would later learn that the sleep was only an illusion. He had never stopped. He had simply gotten better at hiding. Franklin lived in plain sight. He worked as a mechanic for the city's sanitation department, fixing garbage trucks. He was friendly, helpful, the kind of man who lent his tools to neighbors. He threw barbecues, laughed easily, and waved to police officers who had no idea they were shaking hands with a killer. He even lived just a few blocks from where some of his victims had been found. Police had collected DNA evidence from several of the early crime scenes, but there was never a match. Technology was limited. The case went cold for decades. Then, in 2007, a new task force was formed. They began retesting old samples with improved technology. One result came back with a partial match, not to a suspect, but to his son. That meant the killer was a male relative. Detectives watched Franklin's house for weeks. They collected DNA from utensils and pizza crusts he discarded. The test came back conclusive. They had their man. When they arrested him in July of 2010, Franklin looked calm, even puzzled. Inside his home, detectives discovered what one officer called a museum of horror. Hundreds of photographs of women, some alive, some unconscious, some clearly dead. He had kept trophies, jewelry, IDs, personal belongings, even a small pistol that ballistics later linked to several murders. The evidence was overwhelming. He was charged with 10 murders, though investigators suspected at least 25. Prosecutors believed his true count could be much higher. In court, Franklin said almost nothing. He sat motionless while prosecutors described how he had targeted women no one else would notice. He had turned invisibility into his camouflage. His victims lived in poverty, in addiction, in fear, lives already unseen by the world. That was his advantage. No one came looking quickly enough. In 2016, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. He showed no reaction when the verdict was read. When given a chance to speak, he declined. He simply folded his hands and stared at the floor. The families of his victims filled the courtroom, holding photographs of the daughters, sisters, and mothers they had lost. One woman said, "He didn't just kill them, he erased them." Another whispered, "We mattered, even if he thought we didn't." In March of 2020, Lonnie Franklin was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was 67 years old. There were no signs of struggle, no final words. Only silence, the same silence that had followed his victims for decades. After his death, investigators reviewed hundreds of unsolved cases that bore his signature. Many may never be solved. His legacy is a graveyard of names without answers. The Grim Sleeper story is not only about murder, it is about how some killers thrive when their victims are invisible. It is about what happens when society looks away for too long. Franklin killed because he knew no one would notice fast enough to stop him. He was right. For 20 years, no one did. Even now, in South Central Los Angeles, the fear lingers. People remember the years of silence, the faces of the forgotten, and the man who smiled as he destroyed them. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. lived in daylight, but his heart belonged to the dark. He didn't just end lives, he exploited neglect itself. And that may be the cruelest truth of all. And while Franklin hid among the forgotten, another man was killing under fluorescent lights, not in alleys, but in hospitals. He was a nurse, trusted to save lives, even as he quietly took them. Charles Cullen, United States, 1988. Hospitals are places built on trust. People go there to heal, to find comfort, to be safe. But what happens when the person who stands beside your bed, the person who promises to save your life, is the one ending it? Between the late 1980s and the early 2000s, patients across New Jersey and Pennsylvania were dying quietly. No screams, no struggle, just sudden, unexplained deaths during the night shift. And for years, no one connected them to the man who always seemed to be there when it happened. His name was Charles Cullen, and he would later be called the Angel of Death. He looked ordinary, soft-spoken, polite, forgettable. He worked in more than a dozen hospitals and nursing homes over his 16-year career as a nurse. His colleagues thought he was strange, but harmless. He was quiet, dependable, always willing to work extra shifts. No one realized that the more time he spent at work, the higher the body count grew. Charles Cullen's method was simple. He used medicine, the same tool meant to save, as his weapon. He injected lethal doses of drugs like insulin and digoxin into patients' IV bags. Sometimes he targeted the terminally ill. Other times, he killed those who were recovering, patients expected to go home within days. He claimed it was mercy. It was not. In 1988, while working at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, a patient died under mysterious circumstances. Soon after, vials of medication began disappearing. Cullen resigned before anyone could question him. He simply moved on to another hospital, and the deaths followed. Every time suspicion grew, he quit. Every time he quit, he was hired somewhere else. Hospitals quietly let him go rather than face lawsuits or scandal. It was a deadly game of passing the problem along. No one wanted to believe a nurse could be a serial killer. By the late 1990s, patients had been dying in at least 9 different medical facilities. Some nights, Cullen would walk through the wards humming softly to himself, checking IV lines, adjusting monitors, and choosing who would live and who would die. He said later that he could feel when someone was ready to go. But his victims were not ready. They never were. In 2002, he began working at Somerset Medical Center. Within months, patients once again started dying at an alarming rate. One pharmacist, suspicious of unexplained drops in medication inventory, checked the hospital's computer system. Cullen's name appeared over and over, accessing records of patients he wasn't assigned to. He was watching them, studying them, choosing them. In December of 2003, a coworker and friend, nurse Amy Laughren, realized what he was doing. She went to the police wearing a hidden wire and began recording their conversations. Her courage would ultimately stop one of the most prolific medical killers in history. Cullen was arrested on December 12, 2003. At first, he denied everything. Then, calmly, he confessed to killing up to 40 patients. But investigators suspected many more. He said he did it to end suffering. But when asked why he killed patients who weren't terminal, he simply said, "I don't know." Over the following months, he confessed to murder after murder, recounting each one as if listing names on a grocery list. His lack of emotion chilled detectives. They began to realize the scope was far greater than anyone imagined. Some estimates placed his true number of victims at over 400. That would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. In 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without parole. He smirked during the sentencing, refusing to explain his actions. When the judge read his punishment, he interrupted, shouting, "Your Honor, you need to step down." The judge ordered officers to gag him with tape. Even then, he tried to speak, eyes wide, a faint grin on his face. It was the only time he showed emotion, not regret, but defiance. Today, Cullen sits in a maximum security prison in New Jersey. He is 64 years old, still alive, still unrepentant. He occasionally grants interviews, claiming he wanted to help people, but those who study him know the truth. He wasn't merciful, he was in control. He played God, deciding who was worthy of life and who wasn't. His crimes forced the medical industry to confront its failures, the lack of oversight, the silence of administrators, and the system that allowed him to move freely from hospital to hospital. His story changed laws, created stricter reporting systems, and proved that evil can wear scrubs and carry a stethoscope. Charles Cullen's story isn't just about death, it's about trust. The trust patients place in those sworn to protect them, and how, for 16 years, that trust was betrayed night after night by a man who looked like a caregiver but thought like a predator. And while Cullen killed under fluorescent lights, another monster hunted in the open air of Britain, a man who turned quiet bus stops and city streets into his personal trap. Levi, Bellfield, United Kingdom, 2002. In the early 2000s, Britain was already familiar with fear. The Yorkshire Ripper had left his mark decades earlier, and for many, the memory of that terror still lingered. But the country believed those days were gone, that the age of serial killers stalking the streets was history. And then, in the suburbs of West London, the nightmare returned. The victims were young women. They vanished near bus stops, well-lit streets, and places that should have been safe. They weren't robbed. They weren't assaulted in the usual way. They were simply bludgeoned to death, brutally, without warning, without reason. The press began calling the killer the bus stop killer. His real name was Levi Bellfield. He was not a shadow in an alley. He was the man standing beside you in traffic. A former nightclub bouncer, a doorman, and a father of 11 children. To most who knew him, he was loud, arrogant, and quick to anger. To his victims, he was invisible until it was far too late. Bellfield's crimes began around 2002, though his violence had been building for years. He had a deep hatred of women, especially blondes. Friends recalled how he often spoke of teaching women a lesson. When drunk, he became volatile while when sober, he became calculating. His first confirmed victim was Marcia McDonnell, a 19-year-old film student. She was attacked with a hammer just steps from her home after getting off a bus. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, just a single act of savage violence. She died 2 days later in the hospital. 18 months later, in August of 2004, 22-year-old Amélie Delagrange, a French exchange student, was walking home after missing her bus. She was found in Twickenham Green with her skull crushed. The attacks were nearly identical. Police realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The public was terrified. Women began avoiding bus stops at night. The fear was the same as it had been decades earlier, the dread of a faceless predator. Investigators began piecing together CCTV footage from across London. In nearly every case, they noticed a white van near the crime scenes. That van belonged to Levi Bellfield. When police questioned him, he denied everything. He laughed during interviews, mocking detectives, calling them stupid. But behind the arrogance was a man who believed he was untouchable. He had spent his life manipulating others, especially women, using charm one moment and violence the next. He was a narcissist in every sense. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered more horrors. In 2003, 22-year-old Kate Sheedy had been deliberately run over by a car while walking home. She survived, but suffered catastrophic injuries. When shown Bellfield's photo in court years later, she pointed at him without hesitation. "I'll never forget that face," she said. Bellfield's pattern became clear. He stalked women walking alone at night, waited until they were isolated, and attacked with overwhelming force. He did not rape or womp his victims. He simply wanted to control, to destroy, to dominate. In 2006, police finally arrested him after a massive operation linking his van, phone records, and DNA to multiple crime scenes. When he was shown the evidence, he shrugged and said, "Prove it." His trial in 2008 was one of the most publicized in modern British history. The jury heard about his violence, his manipulation, his history of abuse, and his utter lack of empathy. He was convicted of murdering Marcia McDonnell and Amélie Delagrange, and of attempting to murder Kate Sheedy. Later, he was also found guilty of killing 13-year-old Millie Dowler, who disappeared while walking home from school in 2002. That final revelation shattered the nation. Millie Dowler's disappearance had haunted Britain for nearly a decade. When Bellfield was confirmed as her killer, even hardened detectives wept. He had abducted her in broad daylight, killed her, and dumped her body in the woods. It was pure evil without purpose. During his sentencing, Bellfield showed no remorse. He smiled, joked, and stared at the victims' families. The judge called him a cruel and pitiless killer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of release, one of the rare whole-life orders in the United Kingdom. Today, Levi Bellfield sits in prison, serving multiple life sentences. He spends his time writing letters, giving interviews, and occasionally taunting the media with false confessions. He thrives on attention, still desperate to feel powerful. Even behind bars, he continues to manipulate, to deceive, to feed off fear. For Britain, his name became a reminder that monsters do not vanish with time. They adapt. They walk the same streets as everyone else, hiding behind smiles, steering wheels, and ordinary lives. Bellfield's victims were young, full of light, and trusting. He took that light and left nothing behind but darkness. His crimes forced the public to face a truth they didn't want to believe, that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide extraordinary evil. A bus stop, a quiet street, a stranger who looks harmless, that is all it takes. And while Bellfield's hammer echoed through London's nights, another man was prowling the streets of Ipswich, a killer who struck swiftly, silently, and left an entire nation afraid to walk alone. Stephen Wright. United Kingdom. 2006. Some killers hunt for years before they are caught. Some disappear between crimes, hiding in the shadows of time. But for one man in the small English town of Ipswich, the killing began and ended in just 6 weeks. A wave of terror so sudden and so brutal that it changed the way the country looked at safety forever. His name was Stephen Wright, and for 6 weeks in the winter of 2006, he turned a quiet seaside town into a graveyard. The press called him the Suffolk Strangler. Ipswich was not a city of crime. It was peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where people still left doors unlocked. But beneath that calm, darkness was waiting. In October of that year, the first woman vanished. Her name was Gemma Adams, 25 years old. She was found naked in a brook near the village of Hintlesham, strangled, discarded, forgotten. Days later, another woman disappeared, Tanya Nicole, 19. Then Annalie Alderton, 24. Then Annette Nichols and Paula Clennell. 5 women in total, all sex workers, all killed within a few short weeks. Their bodies were left near water, arranged carefully as if posed. Each death seemed colder than the last. The police launched one of the largest investigations in British history. More than 500 officers combed through Ipswich, searching rivers, marshes, and abandoned buildings. Every man in town felt the weight of suspicion. The community lived in fear, not knowing if the killer was a stranger or someone they saw every day. The truth was closer than anyone imagined. Stephen Wright lived just a short walk from the red light district where his victims worked. He was a former Merchant Navy steward, a quiet man with a history of failed relationships and financial troubles. He lived in a rented house on London Road, close enough to watch his victims through the window. He visited the same pubs they did. He bought them drinks. He smiled. They trusted him. When police began collecting CCTV footage from the area, one name appeared again and again. His car, a blue Ford Mondeo, was seen near multiple crime scenes. A search of his home revealed fibers, DNA, and traces of blood linking him to all 5 victims. The evidence was overwhelming. When detectives arrested him, he said only 4 words: "I expected you sooner." In interviews, he remained calm, almost amused. He denied the murders, claiming coincidence and bad luck. But the science told another story. Fibers from his carpet were found on every victim. His DNA was on their skin, and the timing of their deaths matched his movements exactly. The trial began in 2008. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution described how Wright had targeted vulnerable women who were simply trying to survive. He lured them with money, drove them to quiet places, strangled them, and left their bodies exposed in the freezing winter air. The precision, the control. It was ritual. It was power. Prosecutors said he killed for excitement, for domination, for the feeling of being untouchable. His victims were easy prey in a world that rarely cared about them. That indifference gave him freedom. When the verdict came, Stephen Wright was found guilty on all 5 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of release. He sat expressionless as the judge spoke, eyes fixed forward, lips unmoving. When asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head. The families of the victims wept quietly. One mother said, "He didn't just take their lives, he took our peace." Inside prison, Wright remains a mystery. He has never confessed, never explained, never shown remorse. He spends most of his time alone, reading, occasionally writing letters to journalists that reveal nothing but ego. Psychologists describe him as a narcissistic predator, controlled, manipulative, cold. What makes Stephen Wright terrifying is not just how quickly he killed, but how normal he seemed before it began. He didn't spiral slowly into violence. He simply decided, and then he did it. 5 murders in 6 weeks, a storm of blood, then silence. For the people of Ipswich, the fear never fully left. The streets where the women once worked are quieter now, but every shadow feels longer. Every echo of a car engine at night feels heavier, because for 6 weeks, death walked among them, wearing the face of an ordinary man. The Suffolk Strangler showed the world that evil doesn't need time to grow. Sometimes it only needs opportunity, and when that opportunity appears, it strikes, with a speed that leaves no room for warning. 5 women, 5 families, 1 man who never explained why. Stephen Wright will die behind bars, but the silence he left behind will echo for generations. A reminder that even in the calmest places, monsters can wake without reason. And while Wright's killings ended in the chill of a British winter, across the ocean in America, another predator was filling his home with the bodies of women who had gone missing for years. He hid them in walls, in crawl spaces, and in nightmares. Anthony Sowell, The Cleveland Strangler, United States, 2007. There are houses that hold warmth, laughter, life, and light. And then there are houses that swallow all of those things, keeping only silence and the scent of death. In the city of Cleveland, Ohio, one house would become a place the neighborhood wished it could forget. For years, it stood quietly on Imperial Avenue, a small two-story home, paint peeling, curtains drawn. To anyone passing by, it looked like 100 others on the same street, worn down but harmless. But inside, behind the walls and under the floors, something unthinkable was happening. His name was Anthony Sowell, and between 2007 and 2009, he turned his home into a burial ground. The world would come to know him as the Cleveland Strangler. Sowell had once served as a United States Marine. He was disciplined, polite, and outwardly stable. But after his discharge, his life unraveled. He became addicted to alcohol and drugs, drifting through jobs and relationships, leaving behind a trail of violence that went mostly unnoticed. In 1989, he was convicted of rape and attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. When he was released in 2005, he returned to Cleveland. No one imagined he would start again. 2 years later, women began disappearing. They were mostly poor, struggling with addiction, often homeless, women no one looked for quickly. Neighbors sometimes heard screams coming from Sowell's house, but he always had an explanation. He said he was arguing with girlfriends. People believed him. No one wanted trouble. The smell came next. It drifted through the neighborhood. Thick, sickly, unmistakable. Residents complained for months. City workers blamed it on the nearby sausage factory. But the smell wasn't sausage. It was death. In October of 2009, police came to the house with a warrant for sexual assault. They expected a routine arrest. What they found would horrify the nation. Inside the home, they discovered 2 decomposing bodies lying openly on the floor. Then they looked deeper, under floorboards, in the basement, in the yard. More remains, some wrapped in plastic, some buried in shallow graves. 11 women in total, each strangled, each discarded as if she were nothing. The victims ranged in age from 25 to 52. Their names were Tanya Carmichael, Nancy Cobbs, Tashana Culver, Crystal Dozier, Imelda Hunter, Michelle Mason, Kim Smith, Diane Turner, Talacia Fortson, Janice Webb, and LaShonda Long. Each one had a story, a life, and dreams that ended inside those walls. Police described the house as a nightmare. Maggots, blood, the smell of rot so strong it clung to their clothes for days. One officer said, "You could feel the evil in the air." Sowell was arrested, trying to hide just a few streets away. When questioned, he was calm. He spoke softly, smiled occasionally, and denied nothing. He said the women had come to his home willingly, and that things just went too far. He refused to elaborate. Investigators later found evidence that he had lured many of his victims with alcohol or drugs, offering them safety or comfort before attacking. He strangled them with his hands, then left the bodies to decompose in his house. Sometimes, he slept in the same room with them. Other times, he simply closed the door and pretended they weren't there. The city of Cleveland was stunned. Imperial Avenue became a crime scene. News vans lined the street. Families wept as detectives searched for remains, hoping for closure, but fearing what they might find. Neighbors struggled with guilt. They had heard the screams. They had smelled the decay, but they had looked away. At his trial in 2011, Anthony Sowell appeared detached. He watched as prosecutors described every detail of his crimes, every body, every name, every horror. The jury took only 15 hours to find him guilty of 82 charges, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death. During his sentencing, one survivor confronted him directly, saying, "You stole lives like they meant nothing, but they mattered. They mattered to someone." He said nothing in return, not an apology, not even a glance. Sowell spent the next decade on death row, rarely speaking. He refused interviews, rarely left his cell, and avoided contact with other inmates. He died in prison in February of 2021. still unrepentant, still silent. His death brought little peace. The victims' families said that closure was impossible. Too much had been taken. For them, justice wasn't about punishment. It was about being remembered. The house on Imperial Avenue was demolished in 2012. Today, the lot stands empty, covered in grass and quiet. No memorial, no marker, no sign of what was once buried there. Just silence. The same silence that had hidden those women for so long. Anthony Sowell's story is not just about killing. It is about neglect. The neglect of voices ignored, of screams unheard, of people society refused to see. He thrived because no one paid attention until it was far too late. That silence was his weapon, and he used it well. Now, the street where his house once stood is peaceful again, but it will never feel clean. Because some places, once touched by darkness, never truly heal. And while Cleveland was trying to bury its horror, another killer was living quietly in South Carolina. A man who sold homes by day and chained his victims by night. Todd Kohlhepp, United States, 2003. On the surface, he looked like success. A clean-cut businessman, polite, confident. The kind of man people trusted with their homes, their money, their futures. He sold dreams for a living, but behind that smile was a darkness carefully hidden, a predator disguised as a professional. His name was Todd Kohlhepp, and for more than a decade, he lived a double life in South Carolina. By day, he was a real estate agent with charm and ambition. By night, he was a killer. Kohlhepp's story began long before he started selling houses. Born in 1971, he had a troubled childhood, violent outbursts, cruelty toward animals, and an obsession with control. At 15, he kidnapped and assaulted a 14-year-old girl, threatening her with a gun before locking her in his home. He was arrested, tried as an adult, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Psychologists described him as intelligent but emotionally dangerous. When he was released in 2001, he appeared reformed. He registered as a sex offender, changed his name, and built a new life. But he had not changed. He had simply learned to hide better. He earned a degree in computer science, started a successful real estate business, and became a respected figure in his community. Clients trusted him completely. They never imagined the charming man handing them house keys was also burying bodies. In November of 2003, 4 employees at a motorcycle shop were found shot to death. The case went cold. Years passed, and the killer remained unknown. It wasn't until more than a decade later that the truth came out. Todd Kohlhepp had done it. He later told investigators he was angry at a mechanic who had messed up his bike. He walked into the shop with a gun and killed everyone inside. No witnesses, no remorse. After that, he continued living his life as if nothing had happened. He bought land, he built a house, he smiled in photographs. No one suspected a thing. Then came Kayla Brown. In August of 2016, Kayla and her boyfriend, Charles Carver, went missing after visiting a client about a cleaning job. Their friends grew worried when their phones went silent and Facebook posts began appearing that didn't sound like them. Police traced their last known location to Todd Kohlhepp's property, a remote 40-acre lot surrounded by trees and silence. When officers arrived, they heard something faint, a muffled cry. It was coming from a metal shipping container. Inside, chained by the neck and wrists, was Kayla Brown. She had been held captive for more than 2 months. Her boyfriend was already dead, shot and buried in a shallow grave nearby. Kayla told detectives that Kohlhepp had killed Charles in front of her, then chained her inside the container, feeding her once a day and threatening to kill her if she tried to escape. She said he bragged about other murders, claiming he had killed at least 7 people. He told her, "You're not my first. You won't be my last." Police searched the property and found multiple graves. The remains of Johnny and Megan Coxey, a young couple who had disappeared the year before, were unearthed. Kohlhepp had hired them for odd jobs, then killed them both. He kept their phones to post messages online, pretending they were still alive. During his interrogation, Kohlhepp was calm, almost relaxed. He spoke with a smirk, offering details only when it suited him. He described the killings casually, like recounting errands. At one point, he leaned back and said, "I saved you guys a lot of work. You're going to find bodies. I'm just faster at telling you where." He confessed to 7 murders in total, the 4 in the motorcycle shop, the Coxey couple, and Charles Carver. His reason was simple: control. He killed because he could. Investigators called his property a graveyard of secrets. There were weapons, survival gear, and supplies that suggested he had planned for a long time to keep killing. If Kala Brown hadn't survived, he might never have been caught. In 2017, Todd Kohlhepp pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of sexual assault. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Before leaving the courtroom, he told reporters, "I just wanted to be left alone." Today he sits in a South Carolina maximum security prison. He occasionally writes letters to journalists, blaming his victims and claiming the media twisted his story. But there is no twisting what he did. He built his own empire of death, one body at a time, hidden behind the mask of respectability. Todd Kohlhepp's story is not about rage or impulse. It is about control, the illusion of power, the thrill of dominance. He lived in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, and he used that to his advantage. He proved that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. When the police dismantled that shipping container, they found a small calendar scratched into the metal. Kala Brown had been counting the days she was alive. 58 marks in total. 58 reminders that hope can survive even in hell. The land where his house once stood is now empty. Grass grows over the graves, the silence returned. But for those who remember, that silence will never feel clean. And while Kohlhepp's double life ended behind prison walls, another killer was still walking free. A man whose crimes stretched over decades, whose victims were found buried in sand along the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Rex Heuermann, United States, 2010. It began with a phone call, December of 2010. A young woman named Shannon Gilbert dialed 911 from the Long Island marshes, terrified, saying someone was after her. The line stayed open for more than 20 minutes. Then, silence. Police searched for her for months. They never found her alive. What they found instead was worse. While searching the brush along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, investigators discovered a body wrapped in burlap. Then another. And another. Within days, 4 women were found within a small stretch of sand. All had been missing sex workers who had advertised online. All were bound and disposed of with the same precision. The press called the unknown killer the Long Island serial killer. For more than a decade, he was a ghost, a shadow behind the dunes, a voice that vanished after each call. Detectives chased thousands of leads, DNA tests, phone records, nothing held. The case went cold, and the whispers grew. Some believed the killer was dead. Others believed he was still there, watching, waiting, blending into normal life. They were right. In the heart of Massapequa Park lived Rex Heuermann, an architect, husband, and father of 2. He worked in Manhattan, commuting daily to design offices and corporate towers. He was known for his deep voice, large frame, and quiet demeanor. He was a man who seemed ordinary, invisible, just another face in the city crowd. But beneath that facade was something monstrous. Investigators eventually tied Heuermann to burner phones used to contact several of the victims. The calls were meticulous, brief, and cruel. He mocked families, taunted police, and bragged about what he had done. When detectives finally matched his cell tower data, it led directly to his home, the same house where his wife and children slept. Police followed him for months, collecting discarded bottles and pizza crusts for DNA testing. The result was undeniable. His DNA matched samples found on the burlap and hair from one of the victims. The mask was slipping. In July of 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. When officers surrounded him, he looked stunned, repeating, "I did not do this." But the evidence told a different story. He was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, 3 of the so-called Gilgo 4. Each had been strangled, wrapped in burlap, and left near the same stretch of beach. He remains the prime suspect in multiple other deaths, including that of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who vanished in 2007. Inside his home, investigators found a nightmare frozen in time. More than 200 guns, boxes of burlap, maps of Long Island, and a collection of disturbing online searches. He had researched how serial killers were caught. He had studied crime scenes. He had even looked up the families of his victims. He wanted to relive the fear he had created. Neighbors described him as distant but polite. He shoveled snow for others, waved at children, and attended local events. He was the man no one noticed, because monsters rarely advertise themselves. What made Heuermann's story so chilling was not just the brutality of his crimes, but how easily he lived among everyone else. He built homes by day and buried bodies by night. He smiled through decades of suspicion, certain his intelligence and planning would protect him. For 13 years, it did. At the time of his arrest, investigators called it a case that haunted Long Island. One detective said, "He built a life on top of a graveyard." Even now, new victims are being considered, new evidence uncovered. The true number of lives taken may never be known. Heuermann sits in jail awaiting trial, denying all charges. He faces life in prison without parole if convicted. And though he has not confessed, his silence speaks louder than words. Behind his calm eyes lies the arrogance of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else, smarter than science, smarter than time, smarter than justice. But time caught him, science caught him, and justice, however delayed, is coming. The dunes of Gilgo Beach remain quiet now. Wind moves through the grass, the ocean crashes beyond the sand. And somewhere beneath that noise lies the memory of what was lost. The place looks peaceful, but peace is only an illusion. Evil lived there once, hidden beneath the sound of the waves, waiting for someone to listen. It ends as it began, in silence. From rivers and forests to hospitals and homes, every killer in this story wore the same disguise: normalcy. They were husbands, fathers, neighbors, nurses, workers, people trusted to build, heal, protect, and love. And each used that trust as a weapon. If these stories prove anything, it is that evil does not need a mask. It hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment when no one is watching. Every victim was someone's world. Every name deserves to be remembered louder than the one who took it away. The monsters in this series are behind bars or buried now, but the lesson remains. The face of evil is never what we expect. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay human. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which of these killers do you think hides the darkest heart? If you want more stories that explore the shadows of real evil, subscribe, because the next story might be closer than you think.